So we're going to continue in our series called Final Words. And in this series, we've been looking at the last words that Jesus spoke and that he taught about over the course of pretty much the last week of his life. And last night we were sitting in our living room and my daughter asked me, Dad, what are you going to preach on tomorrow? And I said, I'm going to preach on hell. She just kind of looked at me. And I was like, yeah, hellfire and brimstone. I'm going to preach on hell. And some of you right now are offended because I said the word hell in church. And it was like she didn't believe me that I was going to preach on hell and everything. And so then we're getting ready to go to bed. And Melody looks over at me and she's like, what are you really preaching on tomorrow? I said, Melody, I'm preaching on hell. And she was like, oh. Like, it's crazy that in our world today, in our churches today, like I grew up in a church where you couldn't say the word hell because you were going to go to hell if you said hell. That was the way that it was. It was like, you can't say that. That's a naughty word. You just got to point to the ground, like down there, to the hot spot, that type of thing, because you don't talk about it. But when you look over the last week of Jesus' life, and as I said, when somebody's getting ready to die and they know they're getting ready to die, they're very choiceful with their words. They're thoughtful. They really want to get out the lessons or things that into people's lives and make things right and everything. And when you look at what Jesus taught over the last week of his life, Jesus didn't focus on heaven the way that the church focuses on heaven. In fact, Jesus only talks about heaven one time in this, and when in the last week of his life. And when he's talking about heaven, he's really doing it to encourage his disciples. It wasn't like he was breaking out a teaching and saying, heaven is going to be awesome. There's going to be streets of gold and gates of pearl, and there's going to be mansions, and there's going to be all this stuff and everything. Like it wasn't like he was teaching on heaven in that way. But many times in the church world, how many of you, let's just kind of put it through, how many of you have heard more votes or more sermons about heaven than you have hell? And then the sermon, keep your hand up for real quick. And the sermons that you have heard on hell, how many of it was the pastor trying to send everybody there? Like hellfire and brimstone type thing, or trying to scare people into hell. Like we used to do dramas and all these different things that just try to scare people from going to hell. But Jesus didn't do that. And we're going to look at this over the last week of his life, different things that he taught about, starting at the Last Supper with when Jesus taught about heaven. The one thing he taught, and it's in John chapter 14. And Jesus had just finished telling his disciples, he's going to go to the Father and all this stuff. And he could see that his disciples were upset. And he looks at them and he says, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And so he's basically, he doesn't go into the gates of pearl or the streets of gold or any of those descriptions. He's not looking at them and saying, heaven's going to be amazing. You've got to make sure you stay safe so that you can go to heaven and all of that. He's just telling them, listen, I'm not leaving you alone, okay? I'm going to heaven right now, but I'm just preparing the place, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to get you, and you're going to be right there with me again. Some of you may go through and try to study through all this stuff. And there are a couple other little things where he kind of mentions heaven or alludes to heaven, but he's not really teaching on it. Again, one of those things is where the Sadducees came to him and they're trying to confront him and they're trying to get him to say the wrong thing and all of this. And so they asked this big question about where there's this man who had a wife and he died. And I know the law says that if he dies, then the next brother is supposed to marry them and take care of them. And so there was these 7 brothers and they all died off. And you would think at some point somebody would be investigating the wife as to why all these husbands are dying off, just seems like a little bit of common sense there. But they're worried about that, and it's like, well, whose wife is she going to be when we make it to heaven? And in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, it says, in the resurrection, there would be they would marry, they would neither marry nor be given in marriage, but they would be like the angels in heaven. You know, he's really not teaching about heaven or anything. He's not breaking down a big, exegesis of what heaven's going to look like. And I think the only other place where he really kind of mentions heaven is when the thief was on the cross and he tells him to remember me when you come into your kingdom. And in Luke 23, verse 43, it says that he looked over at the thief and he said, truly today you will be with me in paradise, referring to heaven. But he doesn't expound on it. He doesn't teach on it. It wasn't the focus because, we in the church world today, like we teach that Christianity is just so that you can make it to heaven one day. But we talked about this before, that Jesus' desire, even when he told his disciples that they needed to pray, he taught them to pray that heaven would come to earth. It was a desire for the kingdom of heaven and the presence of heaven and stuff to encounter earth, not the opposite way. And so if we're just waiting to get to heaven, then our focus is off of what it should be. Because it centers in on just what our reward is and what we can get. And it makes the gospel all about you and what you get from God. But Jesus didn't speak a whole lot on heaven, but he did in his last week a few times talk about hell. And when he talks about hell, like he's descriptive on it. He is teaching about what it is like. I know there's a lot of different views on what hell's going to be like. People will make a joke and make a comment like, well, I'm going to see you in hell. Like, hey, we're going to go to hell and it's going to be like this big party and all this stuff. And that's not true. When you're in hell, we're going to look at this and it talks about the darkness and stuff. You're not going to see anybody. It's utter darkness. It's complete isolation from everything. There's no partying going on in hell. And when you read the scriptures and what it says about it, I think it's important that we understand this both. I know when you're in a room like this, you've got people that are saved and know God and everything. But I think believers need to know what hell is like, because if they understood what hell was, we would be a little more intentional about the way that we live our lives and the way that we tell other people about God and the love of God and the way that we serve. Because if we truly believed that hell is the things that we're going to be reading about, there is nobody, not even our worst enemy, that we would want to go there. But many of us is like, yeah, hell's horrible. But what are you doing to keep people from going there? And then on the other side of it, some people may not know Jesus, and they're like, well, that's no big deal. It's just going to be like this big party. It's going to be whatever. And that's not the truth either. So we're going to look at what Jesus taught on hell. And I'm going to start kind of just outside of that first week or that last week of his life with a parable, or what many people think is a parable that Jesus is telling us in Luke chapter 16, starting at verse 19. And I'd say many people think this is a parable because this is different than a parable, because Jesus names names in this in very specific details. If you go read any of the other parables, it will say there was a landowner, or there was a shepherd, or there was a fisherman, or whatever. It's very generic in what he does, and it's teaching a lesson. He's not teaching a lesson in this. This is an actual encounter that he is talking about. Luke chapter 16, he says there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate laid a poor man named Lazarus. And Lazarus was covered with sores, and he desired to be fed from what fell from the rich man's table. And moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels into Abraham's side. And the rich man also died and was buried, being in Hades, being in torment. He lifted up his eyes and saw Father Abraham at a distance, and he saw Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. And please send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in anguish in this flame. Now, when Jesus is telling us, I know there's a lot of people who think, well, hell is just kind of a figurative thing. It's a state of mind. It's all this stuff. But if it was a figurative thing and a state of mind, why is this person in torture asking for one drop of water? Because he's in torment. He's in anguish. The word there in the Greek for anguish means tormented. It means pain. It means to suffer acute pain, whether physical or mental. And then even the word for flame, it's not just not like literary painting pictures of things, but the word for flame literally means a flame or fire. This is not just poetic talk. Because if you're just talking poetically, there's not torture and anguish. He talked about torment and he talked about anguish in this. This is literal things of the way that hell is going to be. He goes on, and Abraham, in verse 25, it says, Abraham said, child, remember in your lifetime, you received good things. And Lazarus, in like manner, received bad things. Now he is being comforted here, but you are in anguish. And besides all of this, there is set a great chasm that has been fixed in order that those who would pass here to you would not be able and may not be able to cross over from us. He's telling them, listen, this is once there is a decision whether you're in heaven or hell, it's fixed. There is no change. There is no bridge in between heaven and hell that you can cross over. People from heaven can't go to hell to minister to the people from hell, and people from hell can't escape hell and try to earn their way into heaven. The way that we live our life now determines whether we spend it in heaven or we spend it in hell, and it's determined for eternity. It's not temporary. He goes on and he says, he said to him, then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house because I have 5 brothers. Again, he's talking more details and things that are there. And warn them so that they don't come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, no, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone were to raise from the dead. And we know this later, that Jesus raises from the dead. Not only does Jesus raise from the dead, Lazarus was raised from the dead. A different Lazarus was raised from the dead. The little boy on the funeral of Nain was raised from the dead. You have all these different people that have been raised from the dead, and they still didn't believe. There's so many people who are like, well, if you just gave me a sign, if you just showed me something bigger, if you just proved yourself, like it's a demand, God, prove yourself to me, and I'll believe. And here he says, even if somebody were to raise from the dead, they still won't believe. Like, there's documented things of people being raised from the dead. We just talked about someone being raised from the dead 2 weeks ago. And people still hear that and still continue on with life as if nothing happened. He said in that phrase, he said, save me. He said the phrase, save me from this place of torment. That word torment in the Greek means an instrument of torture. You'll see other places in Scripture that aren't in this last week that we're going to talk about. It talks about like when people hold unbelief in their heart and things and refuse to forgive, that they can't be forgiven if they refuse to forgive, and that they're turned over to the torturers. It's an allusion to the way that the demons will be tortured. You know, there's all this thing that people believe that God is cruel to send someone to hell, but God did everything possible to make sure that people couldn't and wouldn't go to hell. But the one thing that he will not do is force himself or his opinion or his ways on you. Otherwise, that's not true love. He takes away your free will if he forces you to go with him, and he doesn't do that. In Matthew chapter 24 is another place that Jesus taught about hell, and he's teaching about the last days, and he talks about how in the last days there's going to be persecution. In the last days, many are going to be offended. In the last days, there's going to be wars, and there's going to be rumors of wars, and it's going to be perilous times. But this is just the beginning of the birth pains. And he talks about how the gospel is going to be preached in all the world, and then the end will come, and all of that. And he kind of continues on talking about the last days. In verse 36 is where we're going to pick it up. It says, "But concerning the day or the hour, no one knows," talking about when Jesus is going to return. He said, "Not even the angels in heaven, nor even the Son, but only the Father only." But it gives a description of the way that things are going to be in the last days. It says, "For things are going to be like, and it's going to be like the days of Noah at the coming of man. For in those days, people were, the days before the flood, they were eating and they were drinking and they were marrying and they were given in marriage until the day when Moses entered the ark. And they were unaware that the flood came until it swept over them all. And so it will be with the coming of the Son of Man." He's talking about it's going to be a sudden thing. And he continues throughout the rest of 24 and into 25 talking about how that God, when he comes back, it's going to be sudden. There's not going to be that, well, I can live my life however I want, and then at the last minute, just pray a real quick prayer, and that's going to be it. No, when it says that the people, basically, when he's saying they're eating and drinking and marrying and all that stuff, it means they're going to be so distracted and so busy with life that the coming of the Lord is going to catch them by surprise. They're going to be so distracted with what's going on in their life that they're going to miss out on what they should have been living their life for. He warns them to be prepared. And verse 40, he goes on and continues. He says, "There's going to be two men that are in a field. One will be taken, the other one's left. There'll be two women who are grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other one is left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." And when I read that this morning, that stay awake, I remember a documentary that we showed here in the church one time on a movie night. It's called Sheep Among Wolves. And if you haven't seen it, go look it up on YouTube. It's about what's going on in Iran and the great explosion in the church there in Iran, and the way that they know that at any moment that they could die for their faith. They know at any moment that if people knew that they were Christians, they would be disowned or killed or raped or thrown in prison and all of those things. But they understand what they were saved from, and so they want to do whatever they can to reach other people, no matter what it costs them personally. And I remember one of the testimonies that they had in that video was a woman who, they were from Iran, or she was from Iran, and he was from America, and his work, he got moved back to America, and she came back to America, and after, you would think, like, now she has religious freedom, so she can go to any church that she wants to. Now she can be fulfilling the dream that she has in her heart and all that stuff, because America, has all these extra opportunities and stuff. But she would beg her husband, "Take me back to Iran." And he's like, "Why do you want to go back to Iran?" And she said, "Because there's like a spiritual lullaby that's just singing the church to sleep." He goes on in verse 43 and he says, "But know this, the master of the house, if the master of the house had known what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you do not expect." I know they've had all these different books. Everybody thought that God was coming back in the year 2000. That Y2K was going to be the end of it, and God was coming back. There was books written, 88 Reasons Why God is Coming Back in 1988. I think that person got it wrong. Or we all missed it, He says, no man knows. He said, even the Son of Man doesn't know. He goes on and he says, but whoever is a faithful servant, whom the master has set over his household to give food in the proper time. Blessed is this servant when they find him doing so when he comes. So like if the master gave you a work to do, you continue to do it. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all of his possessions. How are we being faithful to do the work that God's called us to do? Verse 48, but if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and he begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, then the master of the servant will come on a day when he doesn't expect him. And at that hour he doesn't know, and he will cut him to pieces and put him with the hypocrites, into the place of the hypocrites. And in that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And when you look at this, we think like a hypocrite. A lot of times we think if we go to church and we've sinned or there's something that we've done wrong, that makes us a hypocrite. No, that's not what makes you a hypocrite. Because if that were the case, none of us would ever be in church. Churches everywhere would be completely empty because all of us have made mistakes and failed and tripped up and things. It's not a thing of you proclaim to be a Christian and you make mistakes that makes you a hypocrite. It's when you pretend like you don't have any mistakes. When you put on the face that everything is perfect and I'm super Christian and all this stuff and you're not open and honest about the struggles and things that you had. The word hypocrite in the Greek, just the basic definition of it means the word there is hypokritos, which means hypocrite, a pretender, or dissembler. But when you look at it in the Greek, a lot of times words are a combination of words. And so I actually kind of left these numbers and stuff in here on this next definition so that you can see how they come together. The word hypokritos, it's made from two different words. One of them is hypo, and that number 5259 is the Strong's number. So if you have a Strong's concordance, you can look it up, and that tells you what that meaning is, which means under, and it comes from 2919, which means krino, which means judge. But when these two words come together, it means properly a judging under, like a performer acting under a mask. And so it's when you hold up that mask that everything is good and everything is great and everything is perfect when really you know it's not. How many of us are guilty of walking into the church as carrying that mask? That all this craziness breaks out and stuff and then we go on like there's nothing. Like there's nothing ever wrong or anything like. This is the church is supposed to be a hospital. The church is supposed to be that when you make mistakes and you're broken and you fall and you struggle and you're having a weak moment or things that go on, that this is the place where you can come and not be judged for your failures, but let down the mask and say, I am hurting. Like I'm struggling right now. I'm battling with some things. And nobody is going to condemn you because of that, but they're going to pray for you. That's why Paul talks about that our job is to bear one another's burdens. He even talks about that if any man is caught in sin, that our responsibility is to restore them with a gentle spirit, understanding that we could fall into the same issue and same struggle that they do. This should be a safe place. Your small groups should be a safe place that you can be honest about what's really going on in your life. But when we go to a small group or we go to a church service and there's an altar call for something that we know that we're dealing with and we don't come up, that's keeping your mask up. We've got to let the masks down. We've got to be willing to say, I'm struggling, I need help. Otherwise, we're walking as a hypocrite. But he goes on, in other words, there is weeping. The word for weeping is klothmos, and klothmos comes from two words, kleo, which means to grieve audibly. It means bitter grief that springs up from a feeling of utter hopelessness. And then klothnos, when it's put together, it means it's usually accompanied by shrieks brought on by uncontainable emotion and psychological pain. So when it says this phrase, and we're going to see this a lot, where it says weeping and gnashing of teeth, it is not talking about, it was a sad movie. No. He's talking about crying out from utter torment, from a complete sense of hopelessness. The word there for gnashing is brucho, and brucho means a phrase that it denotes the extreme anguish and utter despair of a man who has been consigned to eternal condemnation. You think about how bad condemnation is now and how it will beat you down. Can you imagine through all eternity having condemnation thrown at you? You're a pretender, you're a fake, you're a this, all this accusation constantly, and never being able to escape it for one moment. In addition to being in complete torment from flames and things like that. Hell is not a party, guys. Hell is not something that we should comfortably sit in air-conditioned church buildings in soft, cushiony chairs and be perfectly content that somebody is going there. All because, well, what if they reject me? What if they don't reject you? What if they accept what you're saying is truth and they put their faith in Jesus? Look at what they're going to escape and what they're going to be rescued out of. Isn't that worth somebody being a little upset with you because you're a little too preachy? And I'm not talking about beating people upside the head with the word of God. I'm talking about speaking the truth to people in love. That if you don't know Jesus and if you don't make changes in your life, this is not going to just end in a physical death here, but an eternal death of torture and torment. This is not, we just continue the party on the other side. Because it's not a place of fun and enjoyment. Matthew 22, verse 11. We talked about this one a couple weeks ago, so I'm just going to read through it real quick. It says, "But when the king came in, he looked at the guests that were there, and he saw a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'How is it that you came into this wedding without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. And the king said to the man, 'Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness.'" Now, again, like I said, it's not like big party, everything's bright. You see everybody. It's complete and utter darkness, hopelessness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. As I said, he continues on in Matthew chapter 25, and he talks about the parable of the 10 virgins and things. And then he talks about the parable of the talents, which we have alluded to in this series. But we're going to look at, the parable of the talents was there was a landowner who gave one person 5, one person 2, and one person 1 talent and told him, "Do business until I come back." And the landowner comes back to check on what they did with what he had. And it's showing that everything that we have, every gift, talent, ability, every resource, financial thing that we have, that has been given to us by God, and what are we doing to build His kingdom, and that God will check up on those things. That's the thing in between the parable of the talents and parable of the minas and many of the other stories that he tells. But we're going to go to what he told. The first 2 did something with what God gave them, and he said, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the kingdom." And then the third person didn't. In verse 26, it says, "The master answered to him, he said, 'You wicked and you slothful servant. You know that I reap where I haven't sown, and I gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have at least put my money in with the bankers. At my coming, I should have received it with interest.'" So that talent. So he took the talent that he had and he gave it to the one with 10 talents. "For to everyone who has more will be given, and everyone and he will have an abundance. But to the one who has not, what he has will be taken away." And then he said, "Now cast this worthless servant into the outer darkness." You're going to see these phrases repeated again. And in that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then he shifts and he kind of gives a view into kind of like Judgment Day type thing going on in verse 31. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all of the angels that are with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And before him will be gathered all of the nations, and he will separate people from one another, as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He would place the sheep on his right hand, and he would place the goats at his left hand. The sheep will be the people who are part of his flock, who have committed to him, and the goats are the people who rejected him and refused to allow him to be Lord of their life. And then the king will go on and say to those, come, you who are blessed by on his right, come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. You know, many people don't see the purpose of outreach because they look at it and they're like, well, you're enabling people to stay in the position that they are, and you're enabling people to stay in their sin. So why would you do that? Why would you give that stuff to people and allow them to stay? It's because of this next part. He said, then the righteous will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry and give you food, or see you thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did a stranger and come to you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we come to you when you were sick or in prison and visit you? And the king answered him and he said, truly I say to you, if you did it to one of the least of these brothers, you did it to me. And then he will look at the people that are on his left, and he'll say, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire that was prepared for the devil and his angels. Listen, hell was not created for us. Hell was created for the devil and his angels and the demons. God doesn't send any of us to hell. We choose to refuse him as Lord. He sends, there's churches on every corner. There's podcasts everywhere. There's sermons everywhere. There's Bibles readily available to us. The Word of God is being preached everywhere, and we continually reject him because we want to do our own thing, live our own life. He says, when I was a stranger, you didn't welcome me. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And then he would answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't minister to you? And he would turn to them and say, truly I say to you, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. How many times have we missed out on opportunities to minister and love on Jesus because we see somebody who's in drug addiction, or we see somebody who is in a sexual addiction, or we see somebody that is in struggling with alcoholism or gambling or what other sin it may be. And then he said, he looked at them and he says, go away into the eternal punishment. Not temporary punishment, eternal punishment. But the righteous will enter into eternal life. Like, he's not saying that you're saved by your works, that if you go and start giving bottles of water out to people and you start feeding the hungry and everything, that means you're going to make it into heaven. That's not what he's saying, because he already taught in Matthew 7, there's going to be many people who do all the works and say, I cast out demons in your name, I healed the sick in your name, I did all these things, and he's going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. But there is something very important that he is saying here. He is saying that if you truly have a relationship with God and know him, then there should be a desire inside of you to minister to other people, whether it's passing out bottles of water or giving food or visiting them when they're sick or visiting when there is something inside of you that knows that I've been rescued from something great. I've been saved from something horrible. And because of that, I owe Jesus my life. And I'm not going to just use my life for what I can gain in this life now that's going to rust and it's going to be left behind, but I'm going to begin to live my life for others and serve other people and meet the needs of other people. Salvation is not pray a prayer and attend church and you're good. True salvation changes who you are at the very core. It begins to change your desires. You should have a desire for the Word of God. You should have a desire for the presence of God. You should have a desire to be among the people of God. You should have a desire to reach the lost. And if we don't have those desires, we might not be saved. Or we might have just fallen asleep. But either way, there's a response that we need to have. Because if we stay in the sleepy phase, then we may be like the people who see the Son of Man coming and don't even know that it's even happened because it caught them by surprise because they weren't paying any attention. I believe many people in the church are asleep. And God is trying to wake His church up. If we understand what we're saved from, it should put something inside of us to where we don't want anyone to suffer that, no matter what it costs us. And you see this demonstrated by Jesus, that when He's in the Garden of Gethsemane, He is praying. You see kind of the humanity side of Jesus come out in the garden in that moment, because He's in such turmoil and stress because He knows what's ahead of Him at the cross, and He knows the pain and everything that He's about to endure. And He begins to pray, God, if there's any other way, then let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And He goes back and He finds His disciples asleep. And He wakes them up and He says, can't you just pray with me for 1 hour? Be watchful. Be alert. And He goes back and He prays again, Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And He comes back to His disciples, and guess what they are again? Asleep. They had been comfortable that they were Jesus' right-hand men, and that was good enough for them. He goes away and He prays it a third time. And then He comes back and He's like, all right, come on, get up, guys. Because the betrayer's at hand and this is getting ready to start. He could have called down angels to take Him off the cross. He could have stopped anybody. Even they said, they were like, Pilate told Him, don't you know that I could save your life? And He said, nah. He said, I'm not having my life taken from me. I'm willingly laying it down. You see, Jesus set the example of what He wants us to be. The word Christian means Christ-like. He wants those who wear the name of Christ to say, you know what? It may cost me something. It may be hard. It may be difficult. But I'm laying down my life because I realize what's on the other side of it. I'm willing. Jesus laid down His life so that we could find freedom and salvation. And God is asking His church, will you lay down your life so that others can find the same love and freedom? He wants us to give Him the same love that He gave us. 1 John 4:19 says that we love Him because He first loved us. Does our love for Him move us to fulfill and to do the things that God desires? It says His desire that none would perish, but that all would come to know Him. Is that our desire? Or are we just so busy with life, chasing the American dream, and we're not even aware of the people who are hurting and lost? And we're so distracted by ourselves and our own things that we forget about all those people who don't know Him. And if we don't do our part to introduce them, they may find themselves in outer darkness. They may find themselves in a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think one of the reasons why hell is a not popular sermon title is because people don't want to offend any other people. If I say something or even give the illusion that they might be going to hell if they don't know him, then they might think that I'm judging them and all of that stuff. But wouldn't you rather them feel temporarily judged, but possibly receive salvation, than to one day show up in front of him when they will be judged and receive eternal condemnation?